Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we embark on a journey not of conquest, but of steel, tracing the metallic artery that pulsed through the heart of the Viking Age. You are standing now not as a passive observer, but on the frigid, windswept coastline of a small English monastery, Lindisfarne, in the year 793 AD. The salt spray hits your face, the air is still and cold, and the only sound is the rhythmic, reassuring churn of the North Sea. You feel the rough wool of your cloak. It's heavy, damp, and utterly useless against what's coming. Look out. Just beyond the horizon, the water is flat, dark, and utterly silent, but then you catch it. Not a wave, not a bird, but a flicker. A dark shape, low to the water, moving with an impossible speed against the current. Your heart gives a sudden heavy kick against your ribs. Now another, and another. They look like great skeletal fish, propelled by a dozen oars, each one dipping and rising in unnervingly perfect unison. On the prow of the lead ship, the fearsome carved head of a dragon, a serpent of the sea, seems to stare directly into your soul, its wooden teeth gleaming wetly. The silence is the worst part. There are no trumpets, no battle cries yet, just the rhythmic thump of the oars against the water and the rising anxiety in your chest. You are a monk, or perhaps a fisherman, and you probably think this is some kind of monstrous natural phenomenon, a myth made real. That's the first weapon of the Viking raiders, psychological warfare. They didn't just sail, they appeared. They didn't just attack, they materialized. For centuries, Europe had been settling into the post-Roman routine of polite, if bloody, land wars and ecclesiastical squabbles. The northern world, to the civilized mind, was a place of mist, myth, and frostbitten peasants. The Vikings shattered that complacency in a single brutal morning. You probably won't survive this, by the way. It's a very harsh reality check, but standing here, unarmed, against men who view your wealth as theirs and your life as a trivial inconvenience, is a guaranteed one-way ticket to Valhalla. For them, not for you. They're jumping into the shallows now, long legs churning through the cold water, and they are moving with a terrifying focus. You see the flash of steel, not the tiny knives and spears you're used to, but terrifyingly long, heavy swords and axes that look less like tools of war and more like extensions of the wild men who wield them. This is the moment when Europe, its kings, its monks, its farmers, realizes the future is coming for them, covered in mud and swinging a sharpened nightmare. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening tonight, why not post your location and the local time in the comments? Let's see how far and wide our little collective of history buffs stretches tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The initial shock of the Viking attacks wasn't just about their brutality, it was about their novelty. Prior raiders or invaders had come overland, announced by scouts, marching armies and the slow grind of logistics. But these men? They arrived from the sea, a direction no one had truly fortified against since the Roman navy faded away. This, my friend, is where the secret of their conquest begins, not in the forge, but in the element of surprise. You're now running, or trying to, but their long strides are eating up the sand. One of the raiders, a towering man with a thick, well-maintained beard that probably required its own skincare routine. The quirky tidbit here is that Viking men were actually quite fastidious about hygiene, often carrying combs and bathing much more frequently than their Christian counterparts, is closing in. You see his weapon, an enormous single-edged axe, and the glint of the sunlight off the metal is almost blinding. It looks heavy, unwieldy, but he swings it with a terrifying casualness, a motion practiced since childhood. This isn't the crude iron of the local blacksmith. It possesses a distinct dark sheen. A mainstream historical fact we often forget in the rush of the raids is that the initial Viking successes were predicated more on the vulnerability of their targets than the absolute technological superiority of their gear. Monasteries, often located on coasts or river estuaries for easy access and isolation, were the banks of early medieval Europe, holding vast wealth, gold, silver, illuminated manuscripts, and, critically, they were undefended. They were the low-hanging fruit of a continent that had largely forgotten how to fight a true mobile war. The church preached piety, not poleaxes. As you stumble past a stone cross, you hear a sound that makes you freeze, the sickening thrack of the axe head hitting something soft, a wooden door maybe, or something worse. You realize the raider isn't chasing you, he's chasing the wealth. Your life is secondary to the silver and the easy-to-carry treasures. This is a business trip, a very violent form of resource extraction. The debate over the metallurgical advantage is fierce, and this is where the deeper mystery of Viking success lies. We'll get to the iron, the steel, and the remarkable pattern welding soon enough. But for now, look at the contrast. You have local, poorly armed peasant militias and bunks against hardened warriors carrying what are, at the very least, consistently high-quality weapons designed for maximal damage. Historians still argue whether the Vikings possessed a truly revolutionary, proprietary steelmaking technique, or if their conquest was simply a logistical triumph enabled by their ships, combined with a highly effective practice of looting and repurposing the very best weapons produced by their more technologically advanced neighbours, like the Franks. It's a chicken and egg situation. Did their metal enable their raids, or did their raids procure their metal? Consider the psychological impact of seeing a sword on a Viking compared to a local lord. In much of early Europe, a sword was a noble's weapon, a sign of wealth and status, rarely seen in the hands of the common fighting man, who was often stuck with a spear or axe. When a Viking warrior, who in his home country might have been a simple farmer, arrived bearing a gleaming, well-made sword, it signalled a terrifying shift in the balance of power. Every warrior was, effectively, a noble-grade fighter. He slipped behind a thick pillar, your breath ragged, and watch as the raiders systematically enter the chapel. The shouts are less panicked now, more businesslike, a grim form of communication in the Old Norse tongue. You try to translate the sounds into purpose, secure the silver, burn the records, find the food. They are efficient, terrifyingly so. This is a finely tuned machine of destruction. The men are lean, tough, and perhaps most strikingly, they are utterly unburdened by heavy armour. You see some with leather padding, maybe a simple iron helmet, but mostly it is movement and speed that protect them. It's tempting to think of them as savage barbarians, the unkempt, mindless marauders of later propaganda, but that's a dangerous simplification, and frankly a bit of a lazy take. The organisation required to build the ships, navigate the open ocean without modern instruments, coordinate a landing on a hostile coast, and execute a high-value smash-and-grab operation is immense. They weren't just strong, they were smart. They had a profound, pragmatic understanding of logistics, weather, and the geography of continental weakness. The most famous of their weapons, the sword, is already etched into the collective memory of the continent, but it is a relatively rare artifact in the archaeological record, compared to the spear and the axe. This one was a small bearing, and the sun was beating with war. The sword you see now, strapped across the back of the chieftain, is long, double-edged, with a distinctive, heavy pommel designed to balance the blade for a devastating cutting blow. It's an expensive, high-maintenance piece of technology that speaks to the warrior's wealth and prestige. In a world of simple tools, this is an instrument of precision violence, a testament to hours spent in the smoky heat of the forge, hammering, folding, and perfecting the metal. Seriously, it's like comparing a stone chisel to a laser cutter. The difference in potential for destruction is vast. The leader of the raid shouts a command that carries across the courtyard. You understand the intent. Time to go. They are already loading their plunder onto the skiffs they brought ashore, making no attempt to dig in or hold territory. Their strength is in their transience. They hit, they take, they vanish back into the endless, forgiving ocean, leaving behind not just a smoking ruin, but a psychological scar on the entire continent. They watch them leave, the dragonheads turning back out to sea, and you realize the true genius of their strategy, the ability to strike anywhere, any time, with overwhelming force, and then disappear before any organized defense can be mounted. This is not just a fight, it's a terrifying lesson in applied mobility. And all of it, every single blow, every piece of silver, every wave of terror, hinges on the quality and availability of their weapons. You are still watching the retreating figures, the Northmen, as they row silently back toward the open sea, their dragon-headed ships cutting through the water with effortless grace. The air is thick with the smell of smoke and fear, but your mind is already moving past the immediate horror to the how. How did they get here? How did they manage to cross that vast, unpredictable expanse of water and arrive precisely at this moment of weakness? A real answer, the often overlooked secret behind the success of Viking weaponry, wasn't just the steel in their hands, but the wood beneath their feet, the long ship. This isn't merely a boat, you realize. It's a logistical marvel, an engine of conquest, and crucially, the Vikings' most sophisticated weapon system. If the axe was the bullet, the longship was the delivery mechanism, a mobile, terrifying base that turned the endless ocean from an obstacle into a highway of terror. Let's take a closer look, mentally, at one of those sleek, shallow draft vessels as it glides away. The key is its design, which violates almost every rule of traditional European shipbuilding you might be familiar with. You'd expect a deep keel for stability, but the Viking longship, like the famous Oseberg or Gokstad finds, has a remarkably shallow draft. This is a mainstream historical fact that revolutionized raiding. A traditional warship had to stop at a deep harbor. The longship could be driven right up onto a sandy beach, or, more importantly, navigate the twisting, muddy waters of inland European rivers. Imagine being in Paris. You're hundreds of miles from the coast, safely tucked behind your thick stone walls, thinking the sea wolves can't possibly reach you. Wrong. They simply sail up the Seine, suddenly appearing deep inside your territory. The longship transformed the European river network, the arteries of commerce and communication, into the Vikings' private highway system. This strategic mobility meant no place was truly safe, maximizing the psychological pressure on local rulers. They had to defend every mile of coast and every bank of it. They had to defend every bank of every river, a logistical nightmare that quickly bankrupted and exhausted many early kingdoms. The hull isn't built with heavy internal frames, like later ships. Instead, it uses the revolutionary clinker-built technique, where the planks of the hull are overlapped and riveted together. This creates a vessel that is incredibly light, flexible, and strong all at once. When a big wave hits, the hull doesn't rigidly fight the force. It subtly flexes and gives, like a great wooden whale. This flexibility is what allowed them to handle the brutality of the North Atlantic. Think of it this way. Your standard medieval ship is a heavy truck. The longship is a highly tuned sports car, fast, nimble, and built for speed and surprise. You could almost hear the rhythmic thump of the oars now, picturing the crew inside. One fascinating quirky tidbit about the longship is the near perfect symmetry of its design. It was often double-ended. The bow and stern were almost identical, which meant there was no need to perform a slow, cumbersome turning maneuver in a narrow river or channel. They could simply reverse direction instantly by switching sides and paddling the other way, another factor that contributed to their terrifying speed and ability to evade capture. It was the ultimate getaway car of the 9th century. The longship wasn't just a transport, it was a floating barracks. His ships were open, offering little shelter, which tells you everything you need to know about the resilience of the men who sailed them. There were no cabins, no bunks. The warriors slept on their gear, exposed to the elements. But the capacity was enormous. A standard snekker, a type of longship, could carry 30 to 40 men, all fully armed, which meant a flotilla of 100 ships, this happened in some major raids, could deliver an army of 4,000 hardened warriors. Seemingly out of nowhere, the entire design, the shallow draft, the lightness, the flexibility, all points to one primary purpose: speed and surprise. The sail, usually a large square piece of wool or linen, was another engineering marvel, often dyed in bright colours or bold patterns. While the oars provided the grunt work for entering and leaving harbours or navigating rivers, the sail allowed them to cover vast distances efficiently, harnessing the wind to cut down the travel time that would have exhausted and delayed less advanced navies. This brings us back to the weapons. The quality of the sword, the length of the spear, and the size of the axe were all secondary to the fact that the longship got them there, into the rich, soft underbelly of Europe, before anyone could raise an alarm. Without the longship, the finest Ulfbert's sword, which we'll discuss later, would have stayed a local curiosity on the coast of Norway, unable to project its deadly force onto the wolfy targets of England or Frencher. The ship was the essential enabling technology. Historians still argue whether the Viking longship evolved independently in Scandinavia, or if the design was influenced by earlier, smaller boat-building traditions from the Germanic or even Roman past that were refined for the rougher conditions of the North Sea. The consensus leans toward a unique, brilliant evolution driven by environmental necessity and the demand for fast, versatile transportation. What's not debatable is the sheer amount of specialized skill required. Building a longship wasn't something a common carpenter could do. It was a state-of-the-art industrial undertaking that required specialized knowledge of wood selection, often oak for the ribs and keel, pine for the planking, metalwork for the thousands of iron rivets, and a profound understanding of hydrodynamics. Think about the sound, the soft, barely audible swoosh as the sleek hull slices through the water. This quiet approach was part of the surprise package. They didn't lumber or creak, they glided. You'd never hear them coming until they were already beaching the boat. When you remember that crocodile dung sunscreen, just kidding, we haven't covered that yet. But the Vikings did use specialized materials and sometimes quite unusual methods for things like waterproofing their sails with a mix of grease and ochre. Bise, it's a good analogy for remembering that the Vikings were master pragmatists who used the best, most effective technology available to them. Now, imagine the moment of landing. The oars are shipped, the men leap out, and they immediately begin to pull the ship up onto the sand using ropes and rollers. Because of its lightness, a fully loaded longship to be pulled entirely out of the water by a relatively small crew. Why is this important? It means they could prevent the ship from being trapped or burned by a local counterattack, and B, sometimes, when the terrain was right, they could portage the ship, literally carry it, over land to bypass waterfalls, dams, or heavily fortified river sections. This kind of flexibility was unheard of. They weren't just sailors, they were amphibious assault specialists. When you trudge across land, your army must be accompanied by a slow, cumbersome wagon train carrying food, water, and fodder. The Viking force carried its supplies with it on the ship. The same space that held the warriors could hold their provisions. And if they ran out, the ship allowed them to move quickly to the next unguarded village or monastery to reprovision, which is a polite way of saying loot. The longship wasn't just a military tool, it was also a flirting symbol of their culture and social structure. It was an expensive endeavour, requiring the collective effort of a community or a wealthy chieftain. Its construction itself was a mark of political and economic power, and its ornamentation, the carved, often gilded dragon head, was meant to inspire fear in the enemy and pride in the crew. When the dragon head was removed, a practice often used when approaching friendly or negotiated territory, in order to not scare the locals or, more mystically, not offend the local land spirits, a quirky touch of Viking superstition, the ship became less of a terrifying war machine and more of a practical trading vessel, because don't forget, the Vikings were also brilliant traders. They used the exact same ships to conduct peaceful commerce along the Russian rivers and into the Mediterranean as they used to raid. This dual-purpose nature is key to understanding their staying power. They weren't a single-mode threat. They could switch from raider to merchant and back again, using the longship as the perfect vehicle for either commerce or conquest. You see the sheer adaptability required. The ability to pivot from trading furs in Constantinople one year to sacking churches in Ireland the next required a profound strategic versatility. As the longships fade into the mist, the psychological damage remains. The people of Europe now have a new, terrifying constant. The sea is no longer a protective barrier. It is the source of relentless, unexpected violence. And it is the longship, the true foundation of their empire, that enables the famous swords and axes to do their deadly work. The longships are now mere specks on the horizon, leaving you standing amidst the smouldering ruins. You've seen the delivery system, the logistical genius of the Viking threat. But now, you need to understand the material reality of their success, the metal itself. That gleaming axe head, the long, terrifying sword you saw flashed in the sun. Where did that dense, sharp material actually come from? The secret behind Viking weapons doesn't begin in a grand forge with mountains of glittering iron ore. It begins in the unlikeliest, most humble and frankly smelliest place imaginable, the swamp. You must now leave the coast and trudge inland, through the cold, damp wilderness of Scandinavia or the Viking settlements. You are seeking the true heart of their military technology, bulk iron ore. Imagine a vast acidic marshland, spongy and yielding underfoot, overgrown with reeds and moss. The air is heavy with the scent of stagnant water and decaying vegetation. This is the mine. It's not a deep shaft carved into a mountain requiring hundreds of labourers and complex ventilation. It's simply the ground beneath your feet. Here's the mainstream historical fact that underpins all of Viking metalwork. The Vikings generally lacked access to large, high-quality deposits of deep-mined iron ore, like those found in the Mediterranean or later medieval Europe. Instead, they relied on bog iron. This peculiar, naturally occurring material forms when iron compounds, dissolved in acidic groundwater, are drawn to the surface and precipitate out, often around the roots of reeds or in the sludge at the bottom of ponds, forming rusty red, spongy nodules or layers. Essentially, it's iron that has rusted under the water, only to be brought up again. The process of harvesting it is tedious and seasonal. You can picture yourself now, wading into the chilly water in late summer, scraping these porous reddish-brown lumps out of the mire using long hooked poles. It's hard work, the iron nodules are heavy when wet, and the yield is low. This inherent scarcity and the difficulty of extraction are the first constraints that shaped Viking metal technology. They couldn't afford to waste a single ounce of metal. Every piece had to count. The ore itself is chemically impure. It's riddled with impurities like phosphorus and manganese, and critically, its quality varies wildly depending on the specific bog it came from and the time of year it was harvested. This variability means that every single piece of metal that went into a Viking sword was an exercise in risk management for the smith. Unlike later industrial steel production that could rely on standardized uniform ore, the Viking smith was always playing a hand with cards of uncertain value. A quirky tidbit about bog iron production is that the harvest itself was often managed to be sustainable. Unlike destructive mining, a bog that was carefully harvested could regenerate its iron supply over a period of 10 to 20 years. It was a slow, renewable resource, treated with a respect that bordered on reverence, tied as it was to the local land spirits and the community's survival. This made the location of productive bogs strategic secrets, closely guarded by communities. The immediate problem with bog iron, once you've dragged it from the swamp and cleaned off the muck, is that it is still very far from being a weapon. It's essentially a hydrated iron oxide mixed with dirt and organic matter. This necessitates a critical, immediate step, roasting. He'd stack the harvested ore on a raised platform over a massive bonfire, heating it intensely for hours, sometimes days. This dries out the moisture and makes the ore brittle, easier to crush into small and manageable chunks. The smoke rising from these roasting sites would have been a common sight in Viking landscapes, a constant, malodorous reminder of the raw labour required for their military power. The smell alone, a mixture of wet earth, metallic rust and acrid smoke, would have permeated the daily life of a Viking settlement near a good bog. Imagine trying to get your 8 hours of sleep, with that fragrance drifting over your longhouse. It's a very harsh reality for the glamorous image of the sword-wielding hero. This reliance on locally sourced, low-grade bog iron is a major factor in the next stage of the process, the smelting, which we'll cover in the next section. But it also feeds directly into the larger historical debate about the true source of the Vikings' best weapons. Historians still argue whether the bog iron found in Scandinavia was sufficient in quality and quantity to produce the volume of high-quality steel required for the conquests, or if the best Viking swords, particularly the legendary Ulfberts, must have been forged from iron and steel imported from advanced centres in the Frankish Empire, or even further east, along the Volga trade routes. The fact is, while they could certainly smelt basic iron from bog ore for axes, spears and utility items, the sophisticated high-carbon steel needed for the strongest swords was a different matter. The bog iron produced what is known as bloom, a spongy mixture of iron and slag which was mostly wrought iron, a relatively pure iron that is soft and easily bent, but easy to forge. It is low in carbon. To make steel, the iron alloy that is hard and holds a sharp edge, you need to introduce a precise measured amount of carbon, about 0.3% to 2.0%. This required 2 separate production streams, one for the local utilitarian iron, and one for the high-end steel that often had to be sourced elsewhere, or created through incredibly labour-intensive and unpredictable processes, like carburization, packing the iron with charcoal and heating it for days to allow carbon to soak into. The metal. The overall impression you should take away from the bog is one of material constraint. The Vikings were masters of adaptation, but they were constrained by their geography. Their material wealth, paradoxically, was built on an inconvenient, low-yield material. This made every axe and every sword a precious commodity, valued not just for its function, but for the sheer labour and material cost invested in its creation. Now, as you lift a heavy lump of this reddish brittle ore, feeling the cold weight and porous texture in your hand, you appreciate the immense gap between this muddy rock and the finely crafted weapon of ore. It's a gap filled by fire, sweat, and a profound, almost alchemical knowledge. The next step is where the smith takes this dirty lump and, through the intense, smoky heat of a bloomery furnace, begins the delicate, difficult process of transformation. The bog iron is the beginning, but the fire is the crucible of the Viking Age. Without this primary raw material, The entire enterprise, the raids, the ships, the conquests, would simply have been an exercise in club-wielding and finger-wagging, and far less effective. You've left the stinking bog, the source of the rough reddish iron ore, and now you must follow that hard-won material to its next destination, the smithy. Forget the grand stone-built forges of later medieval castles. The early Viking smithy is a humble, dark and smoky place, often a small, separate structure built primarily for fire safety and ventilation. You step inside, and the heat immediately hits you, a dry, fierce warmth that contrasts sharply with the cold, damp outside. The air is thick with the metallic tang of burning charcoal, the earthy smell of clay, and the acrid smoke of the refining process. The heart of this operation is the bloomery furnace. This is a simple, cone-shaped shaft, perhaps 5 to 6 feet high, built from clay and stones, lined with refractory clay. It looks less like a high-tech reactor and more like a carefully constructed mud chimney. You see the smith, a powerful, grimy figure, his face smeared with soot, his forearms corded with muscle, constantly tending the fire at the base. The process you're about to witness is called smelting, and is the crucial, difficult stage of turning that porous bog iron ore into usable metal. The smith layers his carefully roasted and crushed ore with enormous amounts of charcoal. This charcoal is vital for 2 reasons. First, it provides the intense heat necessary up to 1,200 depths. And second, the carbon monoxide it produces acts as a reducing agent, chemically stripping the oxygen from the iron oxide, turning it back into metallic iron. But here's the technological challenge. Viking technology did not allow them to reach the true melting point of iron, around 1,538 degrees Celsius. They couldn't create liquid iron that could be poured into molds. That comes centuries later with the blast furnace. Instead, the furnace produces what is known as a bloom, a porous, sponge-like mass of pure iron mixed with a great deal of solidified impurities and ash, called slag. You hear the rhythmic, desperate pumping of the bellows, often operated by an apprentice or a specialized helper. These are the lungs of the operation, forcing air into the base of the furnace to achieve the required high temperature. This continuous, exhausting labor is what makes the whole process possible. After hours, sometimes an entire day, the smith breaks open the furnace to extract the bloom. It's a terrifyingly hot, glowing mass, heavy and incandescent. This is the moment of truth. The bloom is still highly impure, containing up to 50% slag, a gritty, glass-like waste product. The smith must now begin the grueling process of consolidation and refinement, known as blending or fining the iron. He drags the bloom onto an anvil and begins to hammer it mercilessly while it's still white-hot. This is where the magic and the pain happens. With every thunderous blow, the smith is physically driving out the liquid slag that is trapped within the iron matrix. You hear the sharp metallic clang and see showers of bright sparks flying off as the smith works with terrifying speed, knowing the bloom must stay intensely hot. This hammering folding is repeated hundreds of times. This refinement creates wrought iron, which is relatively pure iron, very tough and pliable but also quite soft, too soft on its own for a truly devastating weapon edge. This constant, rhythmic sound of the hammer on the anvil would have been the soundtrack to every Viking settlement, a sign of industry, power, and readiness for war. Historians still argue whether the overall quality and consistency of locally produced Viking bloom iron were truly inferior to continental iron, or if the Viking smiths were simply so expert at the refinement and pattern welding process that they managed to wring superior performance out of lower-grade material. It's a debate about raw resources versus craftsmen. This intense labour dictated the scarcity of high-quality weapons. To forge a single decent-sized axe head or sword-length bar might require the initial processing of hundreds of pounds of bog ore and many, many bags of charcoal. It was an environmentally intensive, labour-intensive, and inherently low-yield operation. A successful bloom was cause for celebration, a failure, a community crisis. Now, a mainstream historical fact often missed. The Viking smith was not just an artisan, he was an alchemist and an engineer, often holding a high social status, sometimes even considered a figure of minor magical power. The ability to transform dull earth into gleaming steel was viewed with awe. The smith was one of the few people in Viking society who consistently worked with and understood the true meaning of fire and metal, forces that touched on the mythological world of the Norse gods, like Skadi, the goddess of mountains and hunting, and the dwarves who forged Mjolnir. In the process of refinement, a skilled smith would be looking to do more than just drive out slag. you'd be trying to create steel, that hard, edge-holding iron alloy. He achieved this through a process called carburization, intentionally adding carbon to the wrought iron. He might pack the wrought iron bars into a clay box with layers of charcoal and heat it for an extended period, allowing the carbon to slowly soak into the outer layers of the metal. This was a long, delicate, and often unpredictable process that could take days and easily ruin the metal if the temperature or time was wrong. A quirky tidbit is that due to the high amounts of impurities like phosphorus and sulfur often present in the bog iron, the resulting material could be brittle when cold or hot, short crumble when hammered at a forging heat. A Viking smith would sometimes compensate by adding materials, perhaps surprisingly, sometimes bone or horn shavings during the forging process, believing, perhaps correctly, as they contain carbon and nitrogen, that these additions improve the final product, adding an element of ritual and empirical superstition to the science. It was a craft based on feeling, smell, colour, and decades of passed-down wisdom, not written formulas. You watch as the smith takes a resulting bar of this newly refined metal and tests it. He heats it to a certain orange-yellow heat, then, with a controlled sizzle, plunges it into a barrel of water, or perhaps more effectively, will or urine. Yes, really, the nitrogen in salts and urine can help with the quenching process. This is quenching, the process that freezes the atomic structure of the metal, making it incredibly hard, but also very brittle. A moment later, he pulls it out and tests it again. If it shatters, the metal is too hard. If it bends too easily, it's too soft. The key is finding the perfect middle ground, which he achieves through tempering, reheating the quenched blade to a precise, much lower temperature. You see him watching the colour of the metal change from straw yellow to deep blue to relieve the stresses and restore some toughness. The quality of the final blade, its strength, its ability to hold an edge, its flexibility, is not a single event. It is the culmination of hundreds of minute decisions made by the smith, from the moment he selected the ore to the final plunge into the quenching tank. This sword, or axe, or spearhead is not just a tool. It is a repository of immense human labour and specialised knowledge, a true piece of Viking ingenuity born of material constraint and pragmatic expertise. This smith, wielding his heavy hammer in the dark heat, is the true secret behind the Viking conquests. The smith has done his agonising work, hammering the bog iron into bars of usable, but still relatively soft wrought iron, alongside smaller, harder chunks of precious high-carbon steel. You've seen the sheer labour of the bloomery, but that alone doesn't account for the legendary quality, the almost mythical strength and flexibility of the best Viking swords. The real secret, the blend of art, science, and perhaps even ritual, lies in a technique you are about to witness, pattern welding. This is where the Viking smith moves from basic metallurgy to a kind of steel magic. Pattern welding is a highly sophisticated process, developed independently in various cultures including the Celts and Romans before the Vikings, that was perfected by the Norse to overcome the limitations of their raw materials. Since the low-grade bod iron resulted in uneven steel, the smith had to create a composite material that combined the best qualities of different metals, the toughness and flexibility of soft wrought iron, and the hardness and edge-holding ability of high-carbon steel. You watch as the smith selects several thin strips of metal. He takes alternating layers, say, a strip of soft iron, a strip of hard steel, another strip of iron, and so on. He stacks them up like a delicate metallic sandwich, sometimes 6, 8, or even 12 layers deep. He heats this stack to a blinding near-molten temperature, the welding heat, and then, with focused, incredibly powerful blows of his hammer, he physically welds them together into a single cohesive bar. This is forge welding, essentially fusing the metals at the atomic level while simultaneously driving out any remaining slag or impurities. But this is only the beginning. The truly mesmerizing step is the folding and twisting. The smith will take this newly welded composite bar, heat it again, and twist it, literally winding the bar along its axis like a candy cane, then folding it in half lengthwise, welding it again, and repeating the process. You can picture the metal structure inside. With every twist and fold, the different layers of iron and steel are woven together like metallic rope. This is the mainstream historical fact that defines the aesthetic and structural genius of the Viking sword. A single pattern-welded core might contain hundreds of individual layers. Why do this? First, practicality. The repetitive folding and hammering known as faggoting is the final, ultimate stage of purification. It squeezes out any final microscopic pockets of slag and gas, creating a denser, stronger material. Second, performance. The finished core is a laminar structure that cleverly balances the core's ability to flex provided by the softer iron layers, preventing the sword from snapping upon impact, with the ability to resist abrasion provided by the harder steel layers. You have to remember that steel made through traditional means was brittle. This pattern welding process creates a metal that is tough, resilient, and virtually impossible to break under normal combat stress. Finally, there's the aesthetics. When the finished blade is polished and then etched, often using a mild acid like fermented vinegar, the different compositions of the metal layers react differently, creating the famous, beautiful, wavy or herringbone patterns running down the centre of the blade. This pattern wasn't just decorative, it was a visible proof of the sword's quality, a metallurgical signature that screamed, "This is a masterwork, and it will not break." It also held a kind of runic significance, often being referred to as the worm or serpent pattern, hinting at the mythological forces contained within the weapon. A quirky tidbit related to the etching of these patterns is that the smiths were not just using the acid to reveal the pattern, they were performing a kind of material quality control. The clarity and consistency of the revealed pattern were a direct indicator of how well the forge welding had succeeded, showing a uniform bond between the dozens of layers. If the pattern was broken or patchy, the sword was structurally weak and would likely fail in battle. Now understand the difference between the core and the edge. The beautiful, complex pattern-welded metal forms the resilient core of the blade. The actual cutting edge, however, needs to be the hardest metal possible to hold a razor-sharp edge. So, in the final delicate stage of forging, the smith would take a strip of the highest quality, highest carbon steel he could source, often imported, which we'll discuss later, and painstakingly forge weld it to the outer edges of the pattern-welded core. This three-part construction, two hard edges around a tough, flexible core, is the ultimate expression of the Viking smith's art, creating a weapon that was simultaneously incredibly sharp and virtually unbreakable. Imagine you are holding such a finished sword. It's light, balanced, and its surface shimmers with the serpentine patterns that were revealed by the acidic bath. The sword feels alive in your hand. This combination of material efficiency and structural sophistication is the true metallurgical secret that armed the elite Vikings. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of pattern welding was aesthetic, to show off the smith's skill and the warrior's status, or purely structural, to create a stronger, more flexible blade from inferior iron. Well, the structural necessity is undeniable given the material constraints of bog iron. The sheer artistic effort invested in making the patterns uniform and beautiful suggests the status and symbolic value were equally important. A Viking warrior's sword was his life, his honour, and a visible sign of his standing in a society that valued martial prowess above all else. The name for such a sword, often imbued with a sense of its powerful pedigree and the life force of the snake-like pattern within, was often poetic: leg biter, grey steel. The naming ritual was the final act, binding the weapon to its warrior and its intended bloody purpose. This pattern-welded blade, born of the bog and perfected by fire, was the material culmination of the Viking warrior ethos. It was a tool that demanded respect, and one that Europe learned to fear. You've witnessed the arduous, smoky birth of the pattern-welded blade, a masterwork born of necessity and craft. But now we encounter the true enigma, the weapon that defies the very constraints of the bog iron and charcoal furnace you just saw, the legendary Ulfbert swords. These aren't just good Viking swords, they are technological anomalies, weapons that should not have existed in 9th and 10th century Europe, and their existence tears a hole in the simple narrative of Viking ingenuity. Look at the sword the smith is now proudly displaying. It is pattern-welded, it shimmers with the serpentine lines of its twisted core, and it is undeniably strong. Now mentally contrast that with a sword bearing the distinct, often crudely inscribed name, plus VLFBERH plus T, or plus VLFBERHT, plus along its full of the groove running down the blade. You might think of it as the 700th century equivalent of a high-end luxury brand, but the signature isn't just a name, it's a metallurgical fingerprint. When modern metallurgists analysed these approximately 170 surviving Ulfbert swords, they made a shocking discovery. Many of them contained a carbon content of around 0% to 1.2%, an incredibly high amount. This level of carbon transforms simple iron into crucible steel, also known as high carbon or hypereutic tauride steel. This is a mainstream historical fact that utterly upends the narrative of Viking self-reliance. To achieve this level of carbon, the iron has to be melted in a closed crucible at temperatures exceeding 1,400 degrees C to allow the carbon to saturate the metal evenly, and then slowly cooled to create a uniformly hard and resilient steel. Remember the Bloomery furnace? It could barely reach 1,200 depth C, only producing soft, spongy bloom iron. The Ulfbert swords, or at least the high-quality ones bearing the name, were made from it was a metal of almost unparalleled purity, and in the ruins of the furnace's cake there was a metal of almost unparalleled purity and hardness for the era. Why is this so significant? A sword made from high-carbon steel is immensely superior in almost every way. It holds an edge far longer, can be sharpened much thinner without chipping, and, critically, can be made lighter yet stronger than its pattern-welded counterpart. While pattern welding was a beautiful, sophisticated way to make the best of bad iron, the Ulfbert steel was a material science jump, the 10th century equivalent of swapping bronze for steel entirely. This realization immediately raises two massive questions. Where did the steel come from, and who was the Ulfbert that lent his name to these blades? The steel itself, that incredibly pure, high-carbon material, is almost certainly Wootz steel, the famous crucible steel developed in India and Central Asia, which made its way into the Middle East and was the basis for Damascus steel. This means the raw material travelled thousands of miles, across vast swathes of land, through the hands of multiple traders, along the treacherous Volga and Dnieper river trade routes that connected the Baltic Sea to the Black and Caspian seas. The Vikings themselves were key players in these routes, acting as both raiders and merchants. A great example of how commerce and conquest were two sides of the same coin for them, bringing back furs, slaves, and, most importantly, these precious ingots of Eastern steel. A quirky tidbit about the Ulfbert name is the high rate of forgery and imitation. Of the surviving swords, a significant number are actually low-carbon copies. Some bear misspelled or malformed inscriptions such as +VLFBERHTT+, or similar garbles, suggesting that as the brand became famous and desired, a mark of status and battlefield superiority, less skilled smiths attempted to cash in by stamping the name onto inferior, locally made pattern-welded blades. This makes the authentic Ulfbert swords an even rarer and more precious commodity. This is where the debate really heats up. Historians still argue whether Ulfbert refers to a single master smith, a family workshop, or perhaps even a caroling engineer or guild or organisation that produced high-quality weapons. The fact that the name is spelled slightly differently, and the forging quality varies wildly, suggests that it was less a single person and more a brand name, a quality seal used over several centuries, possibly originating in the Frankish Rhineland, an area known for its highly advanced steel production. This brings us to a crucial, if slightly humbling point for Viking enthusiasts. The greatest weapons used by the Vikings were likely not forged by them in Scandinavia, but procured, either through trade, as payment danegeld, or most likely, through looting and conquest from the highly advanced Frankish or Carolingian kingdoms, which we will cover more in depth later. The Vikings were brilliant tacticians and warriors, but they were also pragmatic masters of acquiring the best technology, regardless of its origin. The Ulfbert swords are the perfect, gleaming evidence of this fact. Imagine the value of an authentic Ulfbert blade. It would have been worth more than a farm, more than a ship, perhaps worth the equivalent of a man's entire lifetime of labour. It was a priceless inherited piece of military hardware, reserved only for the very wealthiest jarls and kings, ensuring that the Viking elite possessed a staggering technological advantage over the local militias and poorly armed peasants they often faced in Europe. They were fighting with high-tech imported super steel while their opponents struggled with simple iron. The Ulfbert sword is the ultimate proof that the Viking conquest was not simply driven by brute force, but by an efficient supply chain and a fierce demand for the absolute best military hardware. They knew what good steel was, they knew where to get it, and they were willing to trade, steal, or pay whatever was required to put it in their warriors' hands. It is the secret within the secret, a Frankish or Eastern sword that became the quintessential symbol of Viking power. You followed the journey of the Viking weapon from the smelly bog iron to the sophisticated, often imported, crucible steel of the Ulfbert blades. You understand the core structure, the beauty of the pattern welding, and the scarcity of the finest materials. But a sword is not a sculpture, its purpose is purely lethal. To fully grasp the secret behind its conquest, you must move past the materials science and consider the geometry of destruction, the specific shape, balance, and edge optimization of the Viking sword that made it such a devastating battlefield tool. Hold a Viking sword in your hands now. It's often referred to as a spatha, evolving from the long Roman cavalry sword, but the Viking version is distinct. It is typically a long, broad, and double-edged weapon, tapering only slightly to a rounded or spatulate point. The fact that it is generally bubble-edged is a mainstream historical fact that differentiates it from many contemporary single-edged weapons, maximizing the potential cutting surface. The most crucial element of the Viking sword is that it is overwhelmingly optimized for the cut, the broad, sweeping, limb-severing blow. Unlike later, narrow medieval swords designed to focus force for a thrust against plate armor, which hadn't been invented yet, the Viking sword's purpose was to hack through mail, leather, and bone. Its relatively broad width meant a long cutting edge, and the blade often had a pronounced distal taper. It thinned out toward the edge, which allowed for a keen, razor-like sharpness. Now, look at the fuller, or groove, running down the center of the blade. Often mistakenly called a blood groove, this feature is actually a crucial piece of engineering. It does not exist to channel blood, but rather to reduce weight while maintaining structural integrity. By removing metal from the center of the blade, the smith made the sword lighter, which increased the speed of the warrior's swing, making for a faster, more agile fighter. A lighter sword also meant less fatigue during prolonged combat. The blade's balance point was often deliberately set further toward the tip, giving the sword a palpable sense of momentum when swung, perfect for the powerful overhand cuts the Vikings preferred. The grip and pommel are also key to this geometry. The grip was designed for a sturdy, two-handed capable grip, though often used single-handedly with a shield, and the heavy, often multi-lobed pommel at the end of the handle served the dual purpose. First, it acted as a counterweight, ensuring the balance point wasn't so far out that the sword felt cumbersome. Second, and this is a quirky tidbit, the pommel could be, and often was, used as a weapon itself. In close quarters grappling, or if the edge was too dull or stuck, a warrior could use the heavy pommel to deliver a skull-crushing blow, often referred to as a pommel strike. The sword was, therefore, a three-part weapon: the cutting edge, the thrusting tip, and the crushing pommel. The act of sharpening was a continuous, necessary chore for the Viking warrior. The materials they cut, bone, wood, shields, and other weapons, constantly damaged the edge. A good smith or a dedicated warrior would carry small sharpening stones, often schist or slate, to keep the edge keen. It was a skill practiced constantly, as a dull sword was little more than a heavy club. Even the legendary high-carbon steel needed maintenance, and the quality of the edge was a matter of life and death. The way the blade was designed also spoke to the tactics used. Viking warriors were often part of a shield wall, which we will get to, a tight formation where space was limited. The broad, powerful cut was often preferred because it was less likely to get the weapon stuck in the enemy's body or shield, which would break the formation. They favoured a weapon that could be quickly retrieved for the next devastating blow. Their warfare was savage, direct, and about maximum shocking force. Historians still argue whether the relative standardization of the Viking sword in the 9th and 10th centuries, often categorized under the typology created by the archaeologist Jan Petersen, reflects a deep-seated cultural preference for certain blade shapes, or if it simply reflects the easy availability and trade of high-quality Frankish templates and blades, the so-called Rhine swords. The uniformity certainly points to an effective industrial, or at least widely traded standard. But what about the single-edged blades? While the double-edged sword gets all the glory, the Viking world also extensively used the sea-axe or skrammersax, a long single-edged fighting knife or short sword. This is a crucial distinction. These simpler, more robust blades, some as long as a short sword, were often made from locally sourced pattern-welded bog iron, and were more common among the rank and file than the expensive double-edged sword. Their simple, heavy, cleaver-like geometry made them incredibly practical and versatile, used for everything from clearing brush and cutting wood to the brutal, up-close fighting that often followed the breaking of a shield wall. The sea-axe might not have the glamour, but it was the workhorse of the Viking age, a symbol of the pervasive, everyday martial nature of Norse society. The efficiency of Viking weaponry, therefore, is rooted not just in exotic materials but in pragmatic, deadly design choices. The broad, weighted, double-edged sword, lightened by the fuller and balanced for a powerful cut, was the perfect instrument for the rapid, devastating warfare enabled by the longship. It was a tool engineered for maximal damage against unarmoured and lightly armoured foes, perfectly suited to the hit-and-run tactics of the early raiding era. You are holding not just a piece of metal, but a 10th-century solution to a combat problem, and that problem was you. You've explored the metallurgy and geometry of the sword, a noble and expensive weapon. But if the sword was the Viking chief's status symbol, the true ubiquitous engine of terror in the Viking Age was a far simpler, yet more devastating tool, the axe. Specifically, the great two-handed fighting axe, often now referred to as the Dane axe. This is where the Viking ingenuity truly shines, in taking a common agricultural tool and refining it into a battlefield nightmare. You are no longer holding a sword, you are gripping the smooth, heavy haft of a Dane axe. It feels light in your hands, surprisingly so, which is the first secret to its power. Forget the image of a brutish, heavy logging tool. The fighting axe was a weapon of elegant, terrifying efficiency, designed to deliver maximum impact with minimum weight. The defining feature of the Dane axe is its incredibly long, thin, and crescent-shaped head. The cutting edge could span anywhere from 8 to 18 inches, giving it a massive sweep. This immense reach and cutting surface is a mainstream historical fact that contributed heavily to the axe's reputation. It allowed the warrior to strike with power from a greater distance than a sword or a short spear could manage. The shape, which often flared out at the top and bottom of the cutting edge, is sometimes called a beard or skedo bearded axe because the bottom curve dropped down to protect the upper part of the shaft and extend the cutting area. The genius of the design lies in the weight distribution. The head was surprisingly light for its size because the metal was so thin, almost like a sheet of steel wrapped around the haft. This reduced the overall mass, making the axe fast and less tiring to swing, but the immense leverage provided by the long handle, often 4 to 5 feet long, meant that when it struck the velocity was staggering. The force was concentrated on a very thin, sharp edge, resulting in a shocking and catastrophic wound that no contemporary armour could reliably stop. This lightness is a crucial point that is often missed in popular culture. A warrior swinging a light, fast axe on a long handle is infinitely more dangerous than one swinging a heavy, cumbersome club. The swing of a Dane axe could be delivered with deceptive speed, allowing the Viking to strike first and recover quickly for a follow-up blow. Now consider the axe's role in the battlefield. It was primarily a two-handed weapon, though smaller fighting axes could be used one-handed with a shield. When wielded two-handed, the warrior temporarily forfeited the protection of his shield, making him an all-out engine of offense. This was a statement. I trust my striking power and my skill more than I trust my shield. This kind of psychological commitment alone was often enough to terrorize opponents. The true military advantage of the Dane axe was its ability to bypass light armor. Against an opponent wearing mail, the most common high-end protection of the era, a sword could sometimes get stuck, or the blow would be absorbed by the woven rings. The incredibly thin, sharp edge and the concentrated force of the axe, however, were perfect for cleaving or crushing through mail, bone, and shield. It could strike with such force that it could simply shatter the wooden shields of opponents, ripping open the shield wall itself. A highly effective anti-formation weapon. A quirky tidbit about the Dane axe is that its immense thin head sometimes had a secondary use, grappling. The flared or bearded part of the axe head, combined with its lightness, could be hooked over an enemy's shield rim, allowing the Viking to pull the shield down or away, instantly exposing the enemy to a killing blow. They essentially used their weapon to clear the path for their weapon, a simple but effective maneuver that became terrifyingly efficient in the tight confines of a shield wall confrontation. The axe, unlike the sword, was also much easier to produce using the Vikings' native bog iron. While a sword required complex pattern welding and high carbon steel for the core and edges, an axe head could be forged from simpler, less pure wrought iron, with only a small insert of high-quality steel welded onto the actual cutting edge. This made the axe infinitely more available and democratic as a weapon, equipping a far greater number of warriors with effective, fearsome tools. The cultural significance of the axe is also paramount. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of the free man, a tool of the farm that transitioned seamlessly into a tool of war. This familiarity meant that a Viking warrior was never disarmed. His common tool was always his deadliest weapon. You could argue that the commonality of the axe contributed more to the widespread military success of the Viking raids than the rare and expensive sword. The Dane axe also became the personal, iconic weapon of certain legendary figures, most notably King Cunit the Great, who is often depicted carrying one. Its imagery permeated the art and sagas, becoming the unmistakable shorthand for the ferocity of the Northmen. Its simple geometry, long leverage, light head, massive cutting area was a perfect, brutal answer to the tactical situation of the 930 and 1030s. Historians still argue whether the transition of the fighting axe from a smaller, one-handed weapon to the massive, two-handed Dane axe was a response to the increasingly effective mail and armour worn by European defenders, or simply an evolutionary progression of shock and awe tactics. What is clear is that by the time of the major invasions of England, the 11th century, the Dane axe was the most feared weapon on the field, capable of breaking an enemy's resolve as easily as it broke his shield. This simplicity and effectiveness, coupled with its relative ease of manufacture compared to the pattern-welded sword, is why the axe, in its various forms from the small throwing cast axe to the knightly Dane axe, was the most common and most consistently successful Viking weapon. It's a powerful lesson sometimes. The most sophisticated answer to a problem is a highly refined version of the oldest tool. The axe embodies the Viking spirit, pragmatic, ferocious, and devastatingly direct. You've explored the offensive might of the Viking warrior, the quick, sharp sword, and the devastating Dane axe. But even the fiercest warrior needs protection, and the true secret to Viking military success wasn't just individual skill or superior steel, it was their collective defence, a human machine called the Shelderboard, or shield wall. This formation turned individual fighters, often wearing little to no armour, into an unyielding mobile weapon that could absorb shocks, press an attack, and dominate the battlefield. You are no longer an observer. You are now pressed shoulder to shoulder with your fellow warriors, feeling the heat of their breath and the rough wood of their shields. You are part of the first rank, and the weight of the battle, and the lives behind you, rests on your ability to hold your ground. The primary defensive tool, and the foundation of the Skalborg, is the round shield. A mainstream historical fact is that the Viking shield was, almost universally, constructed from light, cheap wood, often pine, fir or lime, and typically measured between 30 and 36 inches in diameter. Crucially, it was usually not edged with metal, which would have made it too heavy and prone to splintering. The simplicity was the genius. A broken shield could be quickly replaced with a new one carved from the nearest forest. In the centre of the shield is the boss, a distinct, bowl-shaped piece of iron that protects the warrior's hand, which grips the central handle. The boss is the only significant piece of metal on the shield, and it serves an important function beyond mere protection. When an enemy's spear or axe strikes the shield, the curved boss deflects the force, often pushing the tip of the weapon harmlessly to the side, or, even better, causing it to catch on the rim. Now look at how the wall is formed. Behold your shield close to your body, overlapping it with the shield of the man to your right and left. You are not a row of separate defenders. You are a single, continuous wooden carapace. When the enemy charge comes, you brace with your lead leg forward and your shoulder pressed against the shield. The goal is not to dodge, but to absorb and push back. The shield wall is not just defensive, it is an offensive weapon. When fighting an unorganized or less disciplined opponent, the Vikings would use the wall for a terrifying maneuver called the shield shove, a coordinated, slow, grinding push forward. You use the collective weight of the ranks behind you to physically force the enemy backwards, disrupting their formation, knocking them off balance, and creating crucial gaps into which the second rank of warriors can thrust their spears or strike with their axes. The shield wall turns a melee into a brutal, one-sided shoving match, where the side with the better discipline and leverage wins. The close quarters of the Skalborg dictated the choice of primary weapons. Swords and the long Dane axes were difficult to use effectively in the tightly packed first rank, because there was no room for a broad swing. This is why the spear was the most vital weapon in the shield wall, which we will cover next. It allowed you to project force beyond the wall, stabbing the enemy in the rank opposite you, or striking over the shoulders of the first rank from the relative safety of the second. A quirky tidbit about the shield wall is its vulnerability to missile weapons. While effective against a direct charge, the wall offered poor protection against arrows, javelins, or rocks thrown from above or far away. Because of this, the first rank of the wall would often raise their shields high and tilt them slightly forward, creating a testudo-like formation to deflect projectiles, before lowering them for the impact of the main charge. It was a constant adjustment, a delicate dance between defending and attacking. The discipline required to maintain this formation was immense, particularly when facing the psychological shock of a charge. If one man panicked, dropped his shield, or fled, the entire line could rupture, turning the wall into a porous, vulnerable line of isolated targets. The entire social pressure of the Viking military system, where honour and reputation were paramount, was leveraged to ensure that every man held his position. You fought for the man next to you, not just for yourself. Historians still argue whether the Viking shield wall was superior to the equivalent English third militia shield wall. While the formations were structurally similar, the key difference was likely in the consistent quality and lifelong training of the Viking warriors, who fought for livelihood and personal prestige, versus the part-time, obligation-based service of many English levies. The Viking Skaldborg was often composed of men who had fought together for years, creating an unbreakable trust and terrifying cohesion. The shield wall was a force multiplier, transforming a group of mostly unarmoured individuals into a formidable, almost impervious formation. It was the tactical secret that enabled their weapons to be used to their maximum potential. The axe broke the enemy line, but the wall held the line. It was the defensive platform from which the Vikings launched their devastating offense, a testament to collective strength over individual armour. You feel the blow against your shield, the roar of the impact, the sheer physical exertion of holding that line, and you know this wooden circle is your life, and the wall is your victory. You felt the crushing, disciplined pressure of the Skaldborg, the shield wall that was the bedrock of Viking tactics. Inside that wall, the mighty, expensive sword and the sweeping Dane axe suddenly become secondary, too cumbersome to wield effectively in the tight press of bodies. The question is, what weapon does the work inside that claustrophobic space? The answer is simple, ancient and utterly lethal, the spear. The spear was, without question, the most common, most versatile, and most numerically significant weapon in the Viking arsenal. A reliable, cheap, and effective tool that could be used for thrusting, throwing, and maintaining the vital distance between friends and foes. Look around inside the shield wall. Every second-rank warrior and many in the first are gripping a spear. The basic construction is uncomplicated. A long wooden shaft, usually made of ash or pine, topped with an iron head. This simplicity is a major mainstream historical fact that ensured its widespread use. Unlike the sword, which required specialized high-carbon steel and hours of pattern welding, a usable spearhead could be forged from a relatively small amount of the locally available bog iron. This made it accessible to every free Viking farmer warrior, not just the wealthy elite. The spear's primary function in the shield wall is thrusting. You can see the second rank using the narrow, razor-sharp points to stab over the shoulders of the men in the first rank, probing for gaps in the enemy shield line, or striking at the exposed faces, necks, and lower legs of the opposition. The long shaft gives you reach, allowing you to wound an enemy without exposing your own body outside the safety of the wall. In this close-quarters combat, the spear transforms the shield wall into a hedgehog of iron points, constantly threatening anyone who attempts to close the distance. Viking spearheads came in a vast array of shapes and sizes, reflecting their diverse uses. You see some with broad leaf-shaped heads designed for maximum wounding and cutting. Others have long, narrow, needle-like points, perfect for punching through the small rings of mail armour. This versatility meant that a warrior could choose a head tailored for his enemy and his position in the formation. But the spear's usefulness extended far beyond the close-in fight. It was also a formidable throwing weapon, known as a scade or casbear. Before the shield walls clashed, the battlefield often began with a brutal exchange of missiles. A Viking warrior could carry several light spears and unleash a volley designed to thin the enemy ranks, disrupt their formation, and shatter their morale just before the main body of the armies met. The accuracy and velocity of these throwing spears, often weighted and balanced for distance, were honed through years of practice. It was an essential phase of the battle, creating chaos for the enemy to exploit. The spear was also, surprisingly, a status symbol in certain contexts. While most were simple and functional, the spears of chieftains and legendary warriors could be highly decorated. You see one now, its socket, where the iron meets the wood, is intricately inlaid with brass or silver, a visual marker of the warrior's wealth and prestige. This is a QWERTY tidbit, a simple tool elevated to an art object. These high-status spears often had names, imbued with the same kind of magical or symbolic importance as the famous swords, linking the spear's deadly function with Norse mythology. The spear was, after all, the weapon of choice for Odin, the Allfather, a deep cultural link that granted the weapon a kind of sacred weight. The inherent low cost of the spear meant that, unlike the rare and precious swords, an entire Viking army could be uniformly and effectively armed. For every one man swinging an Ulfbert's sword, there were 10 men thrusting a spear. This mass availability was a logistical secret behind the Vikings' ability to field large effective forces quickly. Historians still argue whether the relative length of Viking spears allowed them to outrange their opponent's spears, particularly those used by the Saxons or Franks. While there is no definitive archaeological proof of a standardized length, the tactical focus on thrusting within the shield wall suggests they preferred spears long enough to span the distance between the shield wall and the enemy's line, likely around 6 to 8 feet. The reach advantage, combined with their cohesive formation, would have given them a critical edge in the battle of attrition. Finally, the spear served a practical, non-martial function that deepened its importance. It was an essential tool for hunting large game like boar and bear, and it was used as a walking staff during the long marches and explorations that accompanied their raids. The spear was always present, always ready. It was not just a weapon you picked up before a fight. It was a constant companion, an extension of the warrior's arm and will. Its simplicity was its ultimate strength, a testament to the idea that the most effective tool in war is the one that is the most reliably available and the easiest to master. The spear kept the shield wall solid and the enemy at bay, making it the most pragmatic and potent weapon of conquest. You've stood inside the shield wall, felt the protection of the simple wooden shield, and understood the deadly practicality of the spear. Now, let's address the persistent image of the Viking warrior, the towering figure clad in heavy iron, topped by that iconic yet completely bogus horned helmet. You need to strip away the romanticized myth of 1930, 100th-century opera, and see the pragmatic, often lightly armoured reality of the typical Norse fighter. The secret here is not in what they wore, but in what they didn't wear, and how that lack of heavy protection became a strategic advantage. The mainstream historical fact is that the overwhelming majority of Viking warriors fought with little to no metal armour. The popular image of a Viking clad head to toe in gleaming mail is reserved almost exclusively for the wealthiest jarls, chiefs, and their immediate elite bodyguards. For the average freeman, the farmer who picked up his axe and shield for a seasonal raid, his protection consisted of his shield, thick woolen and leather clothing, and sheer courage. Let's start with the most expensive and effective piece of armour, mail. A mail shirt, or byrnie, was a coat constructed of thousands of interlocking iron rings. It was incredibly effective against cuts from swords and axes, but it was astronomically expensive, requiring a specialist smith many months of painstaking labour to forge and weave the rings. It was also heavy, often weighing 20 to 30 pounds, and incredibly difficult to maintain. An authentic mail shirt was an heirloom, passed down through generations, and often valued as much as a ship. Its scarcity meant that if you saw a raiding Viking wearing mail, you were looking at a man of high status, immense wealth, or a very successful looter. For the common warrior, protection was far more rudimentary. It often consisted of thick layers of leather or quilted limbing wool padded jackets. These padded garments were surprisingly effective against glancing blows and minimized the shock of a blunt impact. This practicality dictated their speed. Remember the whole point of the longship and the hit-and-run tactics. It was about mobility. An unarmoured or lightly armoured man could run faster, row harder, and march longer than a continental knight weighed down by 50 or 60 pounds of iron. The Vikings' lack of heavy armour was a deliberate trade-off, prioritising speed and endurance over heavy localised defence. Now, for the glorious myth, the horned helmet. Let me tell you clearly, this is a quirky tidbit of historical inaccuracy. A fantastical invention popularised by costume designer Carl Emil Doppler for an 1876 production of Wagner's Ring Operas. There is zero archaeological evidence for Vikings wearing horns on their helmets during the Viking Age, c. 793-1066 AD. The few helmets found that do have horns date back to the Bronze Age, thousands of years earlier, and were used for ritual purposes, not battle. The real Viking helmet, as evidenced by rare finds like the Gearmundbu helmet, the only near-complete one discovered, was a simple, practical piece of ironwork. It was often a spectacle helmet. A simple iron cap with a framework of stretched Spangenhelm that protected the skull, and sometimes featured a piece that extended down around the eyes and nose, giving the wearer a slightly insect-like appearance. This design was simple, easy to forge, and very effective at deflecting a blow to the head, the most critical part to protect. This focus on protecting the head is a sensible mainstream historical fact. If you can only afford one piece of metal armour, it's always the helmet. It was an essential investment for any Viking who intended to survive more than one skirmish. But even the spectacle helmet was a luxury. Many warriors simply used a hard leather cap, perhaps reinforced with small metal plates or bone, or just a heavy cloth coif. The secret weapon in the Vikings' armour, or lack thereof, was the element of terror. They often stripped down before a raid, perhaps only wearing the berserker shirt, a tradition in some sagas, or sometimes even entering a battle in a frenzied, near-naked state, trusting in Odin or their own battle rage to protect them. The sight of ferocious, wild-haired men charging out of the mist with axes, seemingly impervious to pain or fear, was a massive blow to the morale of their opponents. The lack of protection contributed to the legend of the Northmen, painting them as inhumanly tough and indifferent to death. Historians still argue whether the relative lack of high-quality armour in Scandinavia was due to a genuine lack of resources, the poor bog iron supply, or a conscious tactical choice to favour mobility and offence. Given the astronomical expense and logistical difficulties of producing and transporting mail, the practical choice was likely a mix of both. They couldn't widely arm everyone, and they strategically chose to use speed as their primary defence. In the end, you realise the Viking warriors' defence was a calculated risk. They relied on their agility, the disciplined cohesion of the shield wall, and the devastating power of their weapons to win the fight quickly, thus minimising the time they were exposed. They didn't win by being invulnerable, they won by being fast, ferocious, and smart enough to target the weak, unarmoured spots of their slower, more heavily burdened opponents. The true armour of the Viking was his swiftness, his shield, and his skill with the axe. You've analysed the metal, the geometry, and the lack of armour. But a weapon is only as deadly as the hand that wields it, and the true, enduring secret to Viking military superiority was not just the quality of their steel, but the quality of the training. For the young Norseman, proficiency with the axe, spear, and sword was not a hobby or a military enrolment. It was a savage, lifelong apprenticeship that was inseparable from his identity, status, and very survival. Imagine yourself as a young boy growing up in a longhouse community by the fjords. You were not given toys, you were given tools. From the age of perhaps 6 or 7, your hands are wrapping around miniaturized versions of the weapons used by the men. This early constant exposure is a crucial mainstream historical fact often overlooked. The Vikings were a truly martial society where all free men were expected to be warriors. There was no professional standing army distinct from the general populace. Every farmer, trader, and craftsman was a potential fighter. Your training begins not on a former parade ground, but in the rhythm of daily life. The small axe you use to chop firewood is the precursor to the Dane axe. The spear you learn to throw for hunting seals or fish is the same one you'll eventually hurl at the enemy's shield wall. Proficiency was driven by necessity. A free man's status was intrinsically linked to his ability to defend himself, his family, and his honour in a world where personal feuds and sudden raids were commonplace. The training was brutal and intensely practical. The sagas describe contests and games designed to hone skills under pressure. You'd learn to fight with a shield in one hand and a weapon in the other, always focused on speed and balance. Because heavy armour was rare, your defence relied entirely on your agility and the quickness of your shield arm. You were trained to be a moving target, not a stationary tank. One of the most intense aspects was the focus on unpredictable scenarios. You would practice fighting on slippery ground, in thick mud, or against multiple non-standardized opponents. A quirky tidbit from the sagas suggests training methods included practicing sword strokes against inanimate objects or even posts sunk into the water, requiring the warrior to perfectly gauge distance and control the weight and momentum of the blade. The goal was to build an innate, instinctual reaction to danger, turning the complex motions of a two-handed axe swing or a sword parry into second nature. The mastery of the axe required a deep understanding of its momentum. You were taught not just to swing, but to use the length of the handle to generate tremendous velocity, focusing all the force onto the thin, sharp crescent edge. The two-handed technique, which made the warrior momentarily vulnerable, demanded absolute commitment and confidence in the strike. Conversely, You were also trained in the one-handed axe technique for use with the shield, where the axe was used as a terrifyingly effective substitute for a short sword. The training regime was a continuous process that extended into adulthood. Regular competitive fighting, often escalating into serious duels, holmgangs over matters of honour, ensured that only the most proficient survived and thrived. These high-stakes contests served as a brutal form of quality control for the warrior class. Furthermore, the constant voyages and raids themselves were an extension of the training, providing real-world experience against diverse enemies with different weapons and tactics, from the Anglo-Saxons' deep shield walls to the swift cavalry of the Franks. The psychological training was perhaps even more important than the physical. The concept of honour philgia and the fear of social shame need were the ultimate disciplinarians. To drop your shield, to retreat from the shield wall, or to show cowardice was a permanent stain on your reputation, often worse than death itself. This social pressure created the fierce, almost reckless courage that characterized a Viking warrior, making them willing to take enormous risks. The stories of the berserkers and Ulfhednar, warriors who fought in a trance-like fury, are extreme examples, but they illustrate the emphasis placed on battle rage and psychological intensity. Historians still argue whether the Viking warriors' skill advantage was primarily due to superior equipment or superior discipline and training compared to their often less professional European counterparts, such as the furred levies of England. While the best Viking weapons were certainly a significant edge, the consensus leans heavily toward the idea that their continuous societal-wide martial training made the biggest difference, transforming the weapons into true instruments of conquest. This relentless, culturally embedded training meant that when a Viking army arrived on a European shore, it was not an army of conscripts or militias, it was an army of hardened, experienced professionals, all intimately familiar with their weapons and the cohesive dynamics of the Skaldeborg. The secret behind the weapons was that they were wielded by men who had spent a lifetime learning how to use them with lethal, instinctive precision. They didn't just carry their weapons, they knew them. You've witnessed the brutal training that transformed a common farmer into a proficient killer. Now, we must turn to the hard truth of economics. While the spear and the axe were the workhorses of the Viking army, the sight of a gleaming, well-made sword was the ultimate expression of power and a crucial secret behind their social and military hierarchy. The question isn't just how deadly the weapon was, but how much it cost, and what that cost meant for the nature of the Viking conquest. Imagine the sword, the product of body and scarcity, pattern welding complexity and often long-distance trade. It was a rare, high-status item, a medieval luxury good. To understand its true value, you have to measure it not in currency, which was often sporadic, but in silver, and more importantly, in labour and land. A mainstream historical fact is that silver, often in the form of chopped-up pieces of jewellery, coins and ingots known as hack silver, was the dominant medium of exchange in the Viking world. Owning a high-quality, pattern-welded sword, or one of the imported Ulfberht blades would have required a staggering amount of this precious metal. The historical and archaeological evidence suggests that a good sword could easily be worth the equivalent of 10 to 15 prime oxen, several slaves, or enough silver to purchase a sizable piece of farmland. This was not a weapon, it was an investment, a liquid form of inherited wealth. This immense cost meant that swords were reserved for the elite, the jarls, chieftains, and wealthy, powerful freemen who led the raids. Their presence on the battlefield instantly denoted a high-value target and a seasoned, high-status warrior. It's like comparing a common infantryman's rifle to a general's personal sidearm. The former is a tool, the latter is a symbol of command. The high cost of the sword served as a powerful economic driver for the raids themselves. To acquire a sword, a Viking of ambition had two choices: inherit it, or earn the silver to buy one. The most direct and efficient way to acquire vast sums of silver was through raiding and demanding Danegeld tribute paid by fearful European rulers. The demand for high-quality weapons created a ferocious feedback loop. The necessity of the best weapons drove the raids, and the success of the raids provided the wealth to purchase those very weapons. The sword was both the instrument and the objective of the conquest. Consider the labour cost. You've witnessed the smith's toil, the days spent smelting the bloom, the hundreds of hammer blows required for pattern welding, the unpredictable risk of the quench and temper. The time and specialised knowledge required meant the smith was paid handsomely. If a farmer took a week to produce enough food to feed his family, the smith might take a month or more to produce one high-quality sword. That intense specialized labor cost was folded directly into the weapon's final price. This hierarchy of weaponry also reflected the social structure. The sword-carrying warrior was the captain, the axe and spear-wielding warrior was the crew. While the latter were respected freemen, the sword-bearer was generally the one who commanded, had the final say in the division of the loot, and possessed the highest social standing. This visible marker of wealth and skill helped maintain the military chain of command, a kind of pre-written contract that ensured a warrior of high status was also armed with the best possible gear. The quirky tidbit regarding the economics of Viking warfare is the use of the wake ring, often made of silver or gold, that served as a standardized guaranteed unit of exchange. When trading or demanding tribute, the silver was weighed out using portable scales and standardized weights, often in multiples of these rings. When a Viking was paid in Danegeld, say, 10,000 pounds of silver from a desperate king, that massive influx of wealth immediately created a demand for the best goods, driving up the price and prestige of the already rare imported crucible steel swords. The economy of terror was highly efficient. Historians still argue whether the economic impact of the Danegeld on the Frankish and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the draining of their treasury and the disruption of local economies, was a more significant factor in the collapse of those societies than the actual battlefield losses inflicted by Viking weapons. It's clear that the economic pressure, created by the need to buy off the Viking armies, often to protect wealth from the very swords they would then use to buy, was a crippling factor for their opponents. The sword, therefore, represents the high-end military-industrial complex of the Viking Age. It was a non-negotiable status symbol, a deadly piece of advanced technology, and powerful engine for economic expansion through violence. Its price guaranteed its scarcity and its desirability, ensuring that the relentless drive for wealth and status, often translated into the gleaming metal of a fine blade, would keep the long ships sailing toward the softer targets of Europe. You've grasped the economic reality that made the sword a cherished, deadly commodity. Now, you must delve into the realm where metallurgy met mythology, the secret belief that the weapon's power came not just from the hand of the smith, but from the spiritual forces imbued into it. For the Viking warrior, a fine blade was more than a tool of war. It was a living entity, an extension of his soul, a recipient of runes and ritual. Step back into the smoky forge. The smith, now finalizing the blade, is not just measuring its balance or sharpening its edge. He is preparing to welcome a spirit into the steel. This is where the pragmatic metalworker transforms into a master of the esoteric. The belief in the weapon's inherent, almost magical power is a crucial aspect of Viking warfare, affecting morale, courage, and reputation. The most visible sign of this belief is the runic inscription. Runes were the letters of the ancient Germanic alphabet, but they were far more than mere script. The word rune itself comes from a rote meaning secret or whisper. Each symbol carried a specific, powerful, often protective or aggressive meaning. Engraving runes onto a blade was an act of enchantment, meant to grant a weapon favourable qualities. This is a mainstream historical fact confirmed by numerous archaeological finds of blades and spearheads bearing runic markings. Imagine the smith now, using a pointed chisel to hammer the distinct angular shapes of the runes onto the sword's fuller, or the axe's blade. He might be inscribing the Tiwaz rune Opherd, which is associated with the Norse god of war, Tyr, and represents victory, valour and strength. Or perhaps the Algiz rune Zed, a powerful symbol of protection and defence. The runes were not simply decorative. They were a plea or a command to the forces of the cosmos to make the weapon hit harder, cut deeper, and protect its wielder from harm. A quirky tidbit about this practice is the placement of some runes. There is evidence suggesting that some runes were deliberately inscribed invisibly, hammered into the iron before the final layers of steel were welded over them during the pattern welding process. The runes weren't meant to be read by mortal eyes. Their power was sealed within the heart of the metal, protecting the core integrity and strength of the sword itself. The warrior knew the power was there, even if he couldn't see the signs, binding the hidden strength of the metal with the hidden power of the symbols. Another essential ritual was the naming of the blade. A weapon of quality and distinction would be given a personal, often fearsome name. You've heard the names from the sagas: Gram Wrath, Hot Aggressor, Legbiter, Hilti Hiltax. This wasn't mere poetry, it was an act of giving the weapon a soul and a reputation. A sword with a famous name, passed down through a family of warriors, carried the collective honour and fighting spirit of its ancestors. The reputation of the weapon often preceded the warrior, adding another layer of psychological terror for the enemy. If you heard you were facing the man wielding grey steel, you knew you were in for the fight of your life. The naming ritual often involved a deep personal connection. The warrior might have spoken to the sword, cleaned it ritually, or even fed it by drawing first blood in a symbolic act. The relationship was intimate. The sagas frequently treat swords and axes as characters with their own personalities and fates. This ritual attachment ensured that the warrior meticulously cared for his blade, keeping it sharp, clean, and rust-free, understanding that neglecting the weapon was akin to insulting a powerful ally. Historians still argue whether the magical properties attributed to Viking weapons were genuine cultural belief, or simply a psychological tool used to boost courage and justify the immense cost and effort put into a blade. Given the prevalence of mythology and belief in fate word throughout Norse society, it is highly likely that the belief was genuine and deeply felt. The faith that the god Tyr was watching, that the runes would guide your hand to victory, and that your ancestor's spirit resided in the hilt of your sword, was an invaluable component of battlefield confidence. Finally, consider the ritual of burial. When a wealthy Viking died, his finest weapons, his sword, axe and spear, were often buried with him in the mound, the ship burial. This ultimate sacrifice, removing the most valuable object from circulation, was a testament to the weapon's importance. It was believed the warrior needed his tools of war and symbols of status in the afterlife. The wealth of weapons found in Viking graves is the physical proof that these implements were considered far more than iron and wood. They were pieces of the warrior's identity, magically charged extensions of his will, prepared for a final, glorious journey. The runes sealed the deal, binding the warrior to his blade, in this life and the next. You've witnessed the spiritual binding of the Viking weapon through runes and naming. Now, let's leave the smoky forge in the mythological landscape of Scandinavia and turn to the grand logistical secret behind the very best of Viking weaponry: trade. Specifically, the astonishing reality that the materials for the most feared and coveted blades, like the legendary Ulfberts, came from thousands of miles away, via the hazardous vital networks known as the Oriental trade routes. This is where the image of the isolated, self-sufficient Norse barbarian could this time we see the universal following silence of self-commerce. And the weapons were a direct product of this vast commerce. You are now standing mentally on the banks of the mighty Volga River, somewhere in what is modern-day Russia, looking at a fleet of longships that have exchanged their dragonheads for a cargo of rich furs, amber and slaves. They are here not to raid, but to trade for the raw materials of conquest. The mainstream historical fact here is the profound importance of these eastern roads, often called the River Road or Eastway. These routes stretch from the Baltic Sea, down through the sprawling river systems like the Volga, to the Caspian Sea and the Dnieper to the Black Sea, and connected the Norse world to the Byzantine Empire Constantinople and the Abbasid Caliphate Baghdad. The primary goods flowing west from these centres was silver, the hack silver that fueled the Viking economy, and, critically, high-quality steel. This was crucible steel, also famously known as Wootz steel, originating in places like India and Sri Lanka, and perfected in the smelting centres of Persia and Central Asia. This steel possessed the high carbon purity and uniform composition necessary to create the incredibly hard, resilient blades that the Vikings prized. It was the material that allowed the production of blades vastly superior to anything they could produce with their own bog iron. Imagine the journey of a small ingot of this super steel. It's forged in the distant furnace in Central Asia, then traded to an Arab merchant, carried across deserts and mountains to a market near the Caspian Sea. There, it is purchased by a Viking merchant warrior, who then begins the arduous, perilous journey back north. The ingot is bartered for valuable furs or perhaps a chain of sleighs. It's a commodity of such high value that it represents a year's income for a common European farmer. The Vikings were brilliant navigators and terrifying raiders, but they were also incredibly pragmatic businessmen. They recognized that a monopoly on the best military technology was a guarantee of victory and wealth. By mastering these eastern trade routes, they ensured a steady, if expensive, supply of the high-carbon steel needed for the edges of their best pattern-welded swords, and most likely for the entirety of the genuine Ulfberht blades. The sword of the Viking Jarl was, literally, an international commodity. A quirky tidbit about these routes is the incredible cultural exchange that occurred. Arab travellers and chroniclers like Ahmad ibn Fadlan provided detailed, if horrified, accounts of the customs and appearance of the Norse traders they encountered on the Volga. These descriptions confirmed the intense focus on hygiene, remember the combs, alongside the brutal rituals of their culture, showing that the Vikings were not isolated barbarians, but sophisticated, if violent, participants in a truly globalized economy. The very steel they used to terrorize the West was purchased from the Islamic world, demonstrating a profound economic and logistical reach. The Oriental connection did more than just supply steel. It also provided the silver that acted as the lubricant of the Viking war machine. Massive caches of Islamic silver coins, dirhams, had been found in Viking hoards across Scandinavia and Russia. This flow of silver created the wealth required to outfit their expeditions, pay for the building of longships, and, crucially, afford the luxury weapons that elevated the status of their leaders. Historians still argue whether the interruption of these eastern trade routes, perhaps due to political instability in the Caliphate or natural shifts in the river systems, contributed to the eventual decline of the Viking Age. A massive sudden influx of silver dried up around the 11th century, forcing a shift in the Viking economy and potentially reducing the supply of the high-quality steel that defined their earlier conquests. The dependence on these far-flung routes highlights the fragile nature of their military advantage. The secret behind the finest Viking weapons, then, lies in a sophisticated, violent, and far-reaching trade network. The gleaming blade of the Viking warrior was a testament to his prowess in combat, and his ability to navigate the Byzantine markets, survive the Russian rivers, and exploit the demand for Eastern goods. The true genius of the Viking was realizing that sometimes the best path to military power is not the forge, but the market. You've travelled the long, perilous Volga routes, tracing the precious high-carbon steel back to the distant east. Yet, there remains a more immediate and uncomfortable truth at the heart of the Viking weapon secret. A significant portion of their best swords, the very blades that became synonymous with Norse terror, were likely not forged in Scandinavia at all, but were imported, looted, or directly purchased from the technologically superior workshops of the Carolingian or Frankish Empire. This theory confronts the narrative of Viking self-sufficiency and places the Frankish forge, ironically, at the centre of the Viking conquests. You must now turn your gaze toward the heart of the European mainland, specifically the Rhineland, the industrial and technological hub of the Carolingian Empire. This region, encompassing parts of modern-day Germany, France, and the Low Countries, possessed deep-mined iron ore deposits, advanced bloomery and carburization techniques, and a standardized, high-volume production system for military-grade weapons. They were, simply put, far ahead of the localized bog-iron smiddies of the north. The mainstream historical fact that drives this debate is the remarkable uniformity and high quality of many Viking-age swords, often classified under the Peterson type. These swords closely resemble, and in many cases, are the Frankish weapons of the era. The most compelling evidence lies with the aforementioned Ulfbert swords. As we've established, the metallurgy of the finest of these blades, high-carbon uniform crucible steel, was beyond the capability of Viking smiths. The most probable origin point for the manufacture of the vast majority of these famous branded swords is the Carolingian realm. Historians still argue whether the Ulfbert mark and similar inscriptions represents a specific Frankish workshop, a guild of master smiths in the Rhine Valley, or a quality control stump of the Carolingian administration. What is not debated is that swords of this quality were highly coveted and were likely being exported, either legally or illegally, to the Norse world. Why would the Franks sell their best weapons to their most aggressive enemies? The answer is a messy mix of greed and control. The sale of high-quality swords and mail to the heathen Northmen was officially forbidden by Carolingian law, a recognition that they were arming our own destruction. However, demand creates supply, and the promise of vast amounts of silver, the hack silver, the Vikings acquired through raiding and Danegeld, was simply too tempting for unscrupulous Frankish and Frisian traders who operate along the river mouths and coasts. They risked severe penalties for the enormous profits that could be made by exchanging a superior Frankish-made sword for a Viking's weight in silver. The Vikings, masters of maritime trade and smuggling, knew exactly how to bypass the official blockades. A quirky tidbit that supports this is the discovery of numerous Viking-age sword hilts and fittings in Scandinavia that are clearly Norse in style, but which contain blades that are definitively Frankish in construction. This suggests a pattern of kit bashing. As the Vikings were importing the high-quality Frankish blades, the most difficult and technologically advanced part of the weapon, and then outfitting them with their own locally crafted pommels, guards and grips. The Frank provided the steel, but the Viking provided the persona and the culture of the weapon. This was a pragmatic, efficient way to acquire top-tier technology without needing to replicate the advanced metallurgy of the Rhineland. The reality, then, is that the Vikings achieved military dominance not just through their own innovations, the long ship, the axe, the shield wall, but through an incredibly efficient, violent, and mercenary ability to acquire and monopolize the best available European military technology. They raided the monasteries for silver, and then used that silver to bribe traders to give them the very weapons that could break the armies designed to protect those monasteries. It is a stunning, ironic twist of history. Imagine the Frankish smiths hammering out a sword bearing the name VLFBRT, knowing full well that the shining piece of national technology was destined to be used against their own king and countrymen. It's a bitter, painful thought, but it highlights the corrosive effect of wealth and trade on geopolitical stability. The Vikings leveraged the internal contradictions and commercial avarice of their enemies to arm themselves with a technological advantage they could not natively produce. The key secret, therefore, lies in the Vikings' strategic dependence on external, superior metalwork. They were connoisseurs of steel, masters of logistics, and ruthless in their acquisition strategies. The finest secret behind Viking weapons is that, in a profound way, they were Frankish weapons, brilliantly employed by Norse warriors. We've traced the weapon from the bog to the battlefield, from the runic enchantment to the Frankish forge. Now, it is time to look forward, beyond the Viking Age itself, to understand the profound and lasting legacy of the Norse warriors' weaponry and tactics. The secret behind the Viking weapons is that they didn't just conquer Europe, they transformed the very nature of military technology and strategy across the continent, forcing their enemies to adapt, innovate, or perish. Imagine the year 1000. For 2 centuries, the sight of the dragon-headed ship in the flash of a Danax had been the constant nightmare of Europe. Kings and nobles couldn't simply wait for the raids to stop. They had to learn from their terrifying teachers. The military revolution forced by the Vikings focused on 3 critical areas: naval defense, weaponry adoption, and the rise of the professional soldier. The longship was such a superior delivery system that European powers were forced to invest in their own rudimentary navies, and, more importantly, in coastal and riverine fortifications. The very river mouths that once served as Viking highways were now blocked by chains and fortified bridgeheads, forcing the raiders to change their tactics from quick raids to slower, more costly sieges. This is a mainstream historical fact. King Alfred the Great of Wessex, who famously fought the Vikings to a standstill, understood this implicitly, building his own fleet of ships, often copying Viking designs, and constructing a network of fortified towns or burhs to deny the Vikings inland access and safe winter harbours. Second, the impact on European weaponry and armour was direct and unmistakable. When you fight a man wielding a swift, armour-cleaving Danax, your own weapons and protection must improve. The heavy, 2-handed fighting axe, once a distinctly Norse weapon, was quickly adopted by the English, the Normans, and even the Byzantines, recognising its sheer power against unarmoured troops and its effectiveness at breaking shield formations. The Battle of Hastings in 1666 AD, which is often seen as the end of the Viking Age, was dominated on the English side by the wielders of the terrifying Danax, a testament to the fact that the Vikings' weapon of terror had been fully integrated into the English arsenal. The sword also evolved. The broad, double-edged Viking sword became the template for the classic medieval sword. The weight distribution, the use of the fuller for lightening the blade, and the focus on the cutting edge, all were retained and refined by continental smiths. European smiths learned the value of high-carbon steel and sophisticated forging techniques, driving an internal continent-wide revolution in metallurgy to match the quality of the imported and looted Frankish or Furt blades. The Viking demand for the best steel ultimately boosted the metallurgical proficiency of their enemies. A quirky tidbit illustrating the subtle shifts is the adoption of the Viking term for battle. In the Norse tongue, a battle was a hilding or a bardaga, but the common term for a battle axe or a war axe, the barda, passed into the Germanic and Slavic languages, showing how the linguistic signature of the weapon followed its physical influence across the cultural and military landscape. Most significantly, the Viking threat forced the professionalization of human warfare. The the farmer levies Fyrd could not reliably stand against the cohesive, highly trained and well-armed Viking Skaldabor. European rulers realized they needed a dedicated class of professional warriors, knights, who possessed the time, resources and training to match the Viking standard. This necessity led to the solidification of the feudal system, where land was granted in exchange for military service, creating the heavily armoured professional cavalry that would eventually define medieval warfare. You could argue that the Vikings' light, mobile, unarmoured warrior model led, paradoxically, to the creation of the slow, heavily armoured knight. Historians still argue whether the enduring Viking legacy on weaponry lies more in the adoption of their specific weapon types like the axe, or in the strategic lesson they taught, that high-quality professional, mobile forces will always defeat poorly armed part-time militias. The consensus strongly suggests the latter. The weapons were the symptoms, but the professionalization of violence was the deep, long-term impact. The very tactics of the Vikings were integrated into the future. Their use of the longship for rapid deployment, their mastery of the river systems, and their devastating use of the shock charge became lessons studied and adapted by the Normans, who themselves were descended from settled Vikings. When the Normans invaded England, their military structure was heavily influenced by the lessons learned from their Norse ancestors, showing the circle of influence had become complete. The legacy of the Viking blade, therefore, is not merely a collection of artifacts in a museum. It is the fundamental shift in European military thought, the adoption of superior steel technologies, and the creation of a professional warrior class designed to combat the very terror that Norse weapons and tactics had unleashed. They were the catalysts of change, teaching Europe how to fight fire with fire. You have reached the final stage of our journey, having dissected the secret of Viking weaponry from the bog iron to its lasting legacy. The final truth we must confront is that all ages, even those defined by iron and fury, must eventually end. The iron sunset of the Viking Age was not a sudden, cataclysmic defeat, but a slow, inevitable process driven by the very success of the Vikings, leading to peace, the widespread adoption of Christianity, and the rust that claims all abandoned steel. The secrets of the Viking weapon were eventually rendered obsolete, not by a single stronger weapon, but by the transformation of the European political and cultural landscape. The core of the decline is a crucial mainstream historical fact. The Viking Age essentially ended when the Vikings stopped being just raiders and started becoming rulers. The very wealth and land acquired by the sword became the force that dulled its edge. Once a Viking chieftain settled and established a kingdom, whether in Normandy, eastern England, the Danelaw, Russia, or Sicily, his priorities radically shifted. He was no longer a mobile entrepreneur of violence. He was a king, concerned with collecting taxes, maintaining borders, and establishing an inheritance. These goals required stability and diplomacy, not constant raiding. The former Vikings became the most effective defenders against new Viking raiders, as they had the ships and the knowledge to anticipate and defeat them. The second, enormous factor in this transformation was the irresistible rise of Christianity. The faith the Vikings had once mocked, looted, and burned became their own. Conversion to Christianity was a powerful political and social tool. It allowed the newly settled Norse rulers, like King Olaf II of Norway, or King Cunit the Great of a unified North Sea Empire, to integrate into the established European network of kings and popes. Suddenly, the old religion of Odin, which glorified endless battle and plunder, was replaced by a faith that preached peace, order, and unified governance. You can imagine the tension. A Viking warrior's life mission was to die bravely and enter Valhalla. A Christian king's mission was to live piously and enter heaven. This shift eroded the very cultural engine that had powered the Viking raids. The call of the longship and the promise of loot could not compete with the organized institutional power of the church. As the political landscape solidified, so did the military technology of Europe, closing the gap that the Vikings had once exploited. The feudal system, spurred on by the Viking threat, created a professional, heavily armoured cavalry, the knights, who specialised in the kind of pitched defensive land battles that were difficult for a mobile, infantry-based army of Norsemen to win. The very targets the Vikings once plundered were now protected by castles, heavily fortified towns, and professional mounted warriors. The Viking strategy of speed and surprise was negated by a continent ready to fight, and crucially, a continent that had learned to build defences that could withstand a siege. This brings us to the changing role of the Viking weapon itself. The light, fast, two-handed Danax, which had been perfect for cleaving through poorly protected opponents, began to struggle against the heavier mail and eventual plate armour of the new knightly class. The Viking sword, though influential, was replaced by purpose-built thrusting swords designed to pierce the gaps in plate armour, a development that came later in the High Middle Ages, but was a direct result of the continuous arms race that the Vikings had started. The demand for Eastern steel waned as European production matured and improved, making the risky Oriental trade routes less economically vital. Instead, I haven't seen that there taken be a sponsor of forks for my health. The sword, once a necessary companion for Valhalla, was often replaced by a Christian cross, or less overtly martial grave goods, a quiet physical sign that the Iron Sunset was spiritual as well as political. The weapon was no longer the centerpiece of the afterlife. Historians still argue whether the decline of the Viking Age was primarily caused by internal political factors, the consolidation of Scandinavian kingdoms, or external factors, the hardening of European defences and the rise of powerful, unified states. Most agree it was a combination, but the fundamental change was that the lucrative, low-risk opportunities for raiding ceased to exist. When the cost of raiding became greater than the potential profit, the Viking Age as a large-scale enterprise simply shut down. The longships rusted in their harbours, the demand for smuggled Frankish blades dropped, and the smiths turned their hammers to crafting crosses and agricultural tools instead of war axes. The final irony is that the most enduring legacy of the Viking blade is its rust. These weapons, the instruments of a terrifying epoch, eventually succumbed to the elements, their power dissolving back into the earth from which their bowline was once scraped. The era of the itinerant, high-status warrior wielding an Ulfbert was over, replaced by the stability of crowns, castles, and crest. You can now let go of the heavy sword and the rough shoe. The sounds of the battle have long faded, replaced by the quiet, settled hum of a continental civilization that was forged anew in the fires the Vikings had lit. The terror is gone, leaving only the history and the realization that the secrets behind the weapons that conquered Europe were ultimately rooted in superior logistics, economic necessity, and the cultural will to use the best available technology, regardless of where it came from. Now, as the echoes of the shield war fade, the air around you cools, and the sounds of the forge and the crashing shields recede, becoming a whisper. You are no longer on the harsh shore of the past. You are back in the soft, quiet space of your own room. Feel the steady rhythm of your breathing, the comforting weight of your blanket, the clash of iron on iron, the shouts of the warriors, the creaking of the longships. All of it is just history now, dissolved into the comfortable silence of the night. The stories are told, the weapons are at rest, and the great drama of the Norsemen is complete. There is no danger here, only the quiet certainty of the present moment. Let the vivid images slowly dissolve, letting the complex narrative settle into a smooth, easy memory. Drift now, let your mind be still, and let the gentle darkness claim you.